Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I am going live back today, speaking to Louisa Ghevaert, who is the founder of Louisa Ghevaert Associates and a very well-known, respected and renowned lawyer in the family and fertility space. And we're going to be talking about parentage today. What does that mean? DNA ancestry, and also about our father and the Netflix documentary. She's written a brilliant article for us all about that. So as soon as she's here, I'm going to let her join and have questions ready. We're so lucky to have her here today, as we haven't had a conversation like this before. So please welcome Louisa. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you.
To you, Louisa. I've given a brief introduction to you, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself, tell everyone what you do, a bit about your experience, and then let's talk about DNA ancestry and parentage.
Well, thank you so much for having me this afternoon, and I really hope today's session will be of interest to, the community and whoever else is watching. I am a solicitor and founder of a specialist fertility and family law firm here in the UK, Louisa Ghevaert Associates. I've been a family lawyer for over 20 years, and I've specialised in fertility law for nearly 15 years. And as part of my practice, I deal with all sorts of issues relating to fertility treatment, egg and sperm donation, surrogacy, complex children and family disputes, posthumous conception, issues around the care and upbringing of children, critically for today's purposes, legal parentage, and also issues relating to things like fertility claims for surrogacy within medical negligence. So there's all sorts of things, and I've been very fortunate and hugely privileged to have dealt with many very complicated and precedent-setting fertility cases here in the UK, which have helped to sort of shape the law for parents, children and families.
And actually, you were on our podcast, weren't you? Maybe 2 years ago or 18 months ago. It's brilliant to have you back on the platform. I was just mentioning to people who were joining that you've written a fantastic article for us, which is all about this topic. And it will be linked up in our bio so people can go through and read more and contact Louisa for personalised advice. So in terms of our father and the Netflix documentary, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I was really struck when I watched it earlier this year at just how powerfully it portrayed real life stories of people who'd undertaken a direct to consumer DNA test and discovered, quite unknowingly, that their biological father was in fact a well-known fertility clinician who had been a secret serial sperm donor for over 30 years. And as I watched the documentary and I watched these real life stories unfold, it became clear just how shocking and distressing it was for people to realise that this clinician had secretly swapped couples' own sperm samples, anonymous sperm samples, for his own sample. Really brought into sort of close context, if you like, the issues that arose from this, simply because of the scale and the magnitude of these deceptive practices, because it showed in quite some graphic detail how nearly 100 donor-conceived individuals were uncovered through this testing, all of whom were related to each other, many of whom were in a 25-mile radius of each other, along with their families, in Indiana in the US. Some of them were finding that their genetic siblings were the basketball coach for their children, and that they were mixing and they were in the same, community groups. And so there were all sorts of issues around that. And really, I think, brought into close sort of context for me, the quest by people to find out the truth about their biological parentage and the significance of that for their personal identity, their sense of who they are in the world, their ancestry, their genetic origins. and also a sense of who their siblings were, their biological relatives. And so it brought into focus an awful lot to do not only just with fertility treatment and donor conception, but that context of who is my parent, who am I, how do I sort of sit in my family and within the world.
And also to find out something like that later on in life must be a massive, massive shock, because everything you have believed to be your life has not been the life that you thought it was.
Incredibly difficult and shocking, and it's a very personal journey for people. I think people go through, a sort of variety of different feelings, from sort of shock and disbelief, and then it portrayed in the documentary sense of anger and betrayal and frustration at what had happened, and then a sense of grief and loss for, the loss of the past sense who they thought they were and their family connections, and then a sense that sort of drive to want to work through these issues and to get to a bottom of, parentage for them, and that sense of who is my family, where is this going. Yes, it was incredibly difficult, and it is for people, and I think that's what people don't necessarily fully appreciate when thinking about issues of parentage, particularly DNA, just how complicated the issues can be.
Absolutely, and I'd invite anyone who wants to ask Louisa anything about this to please ask away, because it's such a fascinating but also highly emotive topic. Could you just explain a bit more about what DNA, direct-to-consumer DNA testing is?
Sure. Well, I suppose in a way, this documentary has really sort of captured the public imagination with it, and it's built on growing interest in direct to consumer DNA testing. Over 40 million people worldwide are now estimated to have done one of these tests, and they can be ordered online from a number of different providers, people like Ancestry, 23andMe, Parentage, and they can be relatively inexpensive. They can cost under £100 or more, depending upon the type of analysis that you're looking for. Some people are wanting to look into their ancestry. Other people are interested in perhaps exploring their genetic makeup and also health risk, sort of predispositions, although there is some concern as to the accuracy as yet with these tests for sort of health and genetic information. And basically you do a swab of your cheek with from the kit, and then you send it back by post and it gets processed. That is the sample in the lab. And then the results get uploaded to their database. And then you can check the results and find out more about your personal ancestry, where your ancestors have come from, and sometimes, as I've said, more information about your genetic origins. And from that, you can build family trees, and you can also start to get a sense for and begin to trace who your genetic relatives might be.
Which can be, I'm sure, positive and negative, can't it? Because, for example, with donor conception, if you were potentially looking for the donor and the donor hadn't agreed to that, and then you went off on your own hunt to connect, you may not get the reception or the response that you're looking for.
Absolutely, and I think people need to be very mindful of the sensitivities and the complexities around, people's private and family life, and the issues and implications that can come from direct to consumer DNA testing, because they can uncover all sorts of things. They can, lead to discoveries that the person you thought was a biological parent isn't. It can flag up the fact that perhaps the birth certificate is incorrect. And as you said, it can also lead to people tracing, biological parents and genetic relatives and siblings in a way that people weren't expecting. But they can also, I think, really mix up, upend, and even change people's family narratives, because all sorts of things can come out of the woodwork with these. People can learn about stories of unplanned pregnancy and secret love affairs, failed relationships. It can uncover histories of egg and sperm donation, which might have been kept quiet within the family and person's history. It can uncover things about adoption. It can also flag up unknown relatives, which can come as a shock. And sometimes, as in the case of Our Father documentary, it can uncover serious issues of emerging concepts of fertility fraud, and even occasionally situations where there's been an embryo mix-up or an egg and sperm mix-up at a clinic. So people can take one of these tests, perhaps being a bit curious about where they might come from and sort of what their ethnicity sort of background might be. You know, are they half Irish and a quarter Scottish and, you know, a bit Scandi? They might get one of these tests perhaps for Christmas or as a birthday present. You know, they might be interested in perhaps genealogy and building a family tree. But what can start out sort of, you know, with that in mind can then, you know, potentially uncover, you know, all sorts of things and really lead people down a path and a journey that perhaps they hadn't thought through, that they weren't necessarily fully aware of. And also it can have implications for other people as well, because you don't have to have taken one of these tests yourself to find yourself involved or caught in the issues that arise from these tests, because you can be traced or implicated or involved, you know, if a genetic relative of yours has taken one of these tests, perhaps your aunt or uncle or sibling or cousin has taken one, and that can be sufficient for you to pop up on these databases and these family trees that, you know, are there, and these connections and, you know, journeys can start, and it can impact individuals that way. It can also you know, impact people's partners and their spouses, their children and their families as well. So they need to be handled not just from a sort of a medical and a genetic perspective, but people also need to think about, you know, the legal aspects of this and also the wider implications.
Great question that's come in. Do you think commercial DNA testing has made the UK laws around donor anonymity until 18 no longer appropriate, as in clinics cannot really guarantee this?
Absolutely. Direct-to-consumer DNA testing has undermined structures of donor anonymity and the current system here in the UK of identity release donation, because by the very nature of these tests, people can trace their genetic origins, they can trace their biological parents, they can trace their egg and sperm donors. And so that's causing, you know, huge tensions with current laws here in the UK, because at present, fertility patients, if they're conceiving with donor eggs or sperm at a licensed clinic here in the UK, will be given non-identifying information about their donor. Things like eye colour, hair colour, height, occupation, and a pen sketch. And then their donor conceived offspring, when they themselves reach 16 years of age, can currently contact the HFEA for the release of their non-identifying donor information if they're not already aware of that. And then aged 18, donor conceived people can apply to the HFEA directly for identifying information about their donor. So that's name, date of birth, place of birth, address, so that they can seek to make contact with them should they so wish. And the thinking around that structure was very much to, if you like, protect the family unit of the fertility patient, the parent and their donor conceived child during that child's minority, and also to give some space and some headway for the donor. And we're still in a phase, if you like, where we're still wanting to and needing to find out quite what the current regime means, because the first cohort of donor conceived people who can apply to the HFEA for their donors identifying information kicks in next year, 2023, but it's being fast outpaced, if you like, by these direct-to-consumer DNA tests, which are short-circuiting the whole process, and they can make it much more of a sort of a knotty issue for people. You know, perhaps you might be curious as a parent in a way that perhaps you hadn't necessarily thought you might be when you were at the clinic thinking about conceiving, or perhaps, you know, you've got a child who's asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have the answers to, or perhaps there's a medical issue, or something has sort of come up where, you know, has sort of changed the family perspective about a situation. And all of that can lead to curiosity, and new dynamics. And of course, if the technology is there, the facility is there, it can lead people to take these tests, and sit outside, you know, the current legal system. And so the HFEA at the moment is currently thinking about all of this, and it is in the process actually of making recommendations for potential law reform here in the UK. And it is currently talking about and thinking about the prospect of perhaps making donor information available, say, at the time of birth of the child,
Right.
in some new format because of this new
Yeah.
reality. I think.
Do you think there's anything positive about DNA testing?
I think DNA testing gives people an opportunity to sort of sense check, if you like, in a number of different scenarios, because it can, as I've said, enable people to build family trees, and it can enable people to trace biological parents and donors. So there have been a couple of cases very recently that have come out of the court where people who've been adopted but
Yeah.
didn't know about their birth parents has actually been able to trace their birth families, if you like, and their biological history via these tests. And they've then been able to secure rectified birth certificates that record their birth parents, so that missing pieces of the jigsaw there for them have been filled in without upsetting, if you like, the legal history that went around their adoption. People have also been using these tests to track down, you know, absent fathers that they just never knew anything about. You know, perhaps their birth certificate was blank. And so for those individuals, it can be hugely important to be able to get a sense of and trace an absent biological parent, for their sense of identity, and understanding of who they are, but also for their own children and future generations, because I think we're all becoming more aware about the significance of genetics, and what that means for who we are. And also, as the technology improves, we're seeing more of that begin to be embedded into healthcare. And we're seeing a swing now towards tailored medical interventions, which are tailored towards people's genetic predispositions and makeup. And so having a sense of that genetic history and that lineage is going to, I think, become even more important for people. So the technology is there, people are using it in all sorts of different ways, and they're also using it to rectify birth certificates, because these sorts of tests can provide evidence to challenge what's on a birth certificate if people have perhaps had a long standing sort of sense that perhaps, you know, the person that the family said is their parent and is on their birth certificate isn't. And people can now double check, and also people very occasionally have this nagging sense that, you know, has they.
And why is this important? Why is DNA testing and parentage important to people in the trying to conceive community?
Well, I think this technology is important to anybody and everybody should be aware, but particularly for those looking to conceive and in the fertility community, whether you're a fertility patient, you're an egg or sperm donor, you're a donor conceived individual, or you're the parent of a donor conceived child, simply because these tests now mean that biological origins of donors, and biological, sort of history can be found. And so that's a reality, and it's a risk, even though you've gone to a clinic and the clinic currently is saying, well, we're only going to give you non-identifying information, and, you know, this information won't become available to your donor conceived child until they reach 18. The risk is it gets uncovered, and pop up, whether it's from, you know, the donor's genetic side of the family, or from some other sort of source that it gets back. So that's really important. But I think it's in the wider context, more and more people are undertaking fertility treatment now because parenting is leading to later life parenthood because of all the stresses that there are out there. Education and cost of living and trying to get on the housing ladder, and people are trying to sort of get themselves to a position where they feel ready to parent. And people are using more in the way of donor eggs and sperm in order to conceive, either because of unexplained infertility or age-related fertility decline, or because they, building a family in a non-traditional form as a solo parent, same-sex parent, later life parent. And so again, these genetic aspects of family creation and family life are becoming more prevalent, they're becoming more relevant. And so it goes hand in hand with the fact we're becoming more aware of genetics in a number of different ways. And that inevitably is feeding in then to people's curiosity and people's use of DNA testing.
We've just had a question come in, if I could ask you, please. What rights do you have if you do a DNA test to confirm the father of a child is a biological father, if the father has decided to abandon responsibilities?
Well, at the end of the day, there are a number of things that can be done if people are being uncooperative, or there are, there's confusion or suspicion. It's potentially possible to make an application to court for a declaration of parentage in the family court under section 55A of the Family Law Act 1986. And that's an application which can lead to a determination as to whether someone is or is not a legal and biological parent of a child. And it can lead to the rectification or re-registration of a child's birth certificate. So if there's a dispute about parentage, either because of a DNA test or more generally, that application can be used to clarify and confirm legal parentage and birth certificates. And within that type of application, it's possible to make an application for a court direction for DNA testing. And that would be a chain of secure chain of command DNA testing through a legally accredited DNA testing facility, which again can be done using a swab, but it's put in a sort of a tamper-free chain that goes back to the lab so that there is clarity over the test results, and that gives as much confirmation as possible as to biological parentage. Now, the issue with that is that not everybody will take a DNA test, and the court can't force someone to take a DNA test following a direction. But what it can do in appropriate circumstances on a case-by-case basis is to draw legal inferences, a kind of reasoned conclusion, if it looks carefully at all of the evidence in appropriate circumstances, and it can conclude that someone is deliberately refusing to take a test to hide the truth that they are in fact the biological parent. And then that can lead to findings, as I said, of legal parentage. And that's really significant because obviously if you've got a finding of legal parentage, then all sorts of rights and responsibilities in law can flow from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just going back a step, could you just explain to people watching, and everyone should go to the link in bio to read the most brilliant article which Louisa has written around parentage and DNA, ancestry and tests, consumer tests. What is parentage?
That's a great question. And it means different things, because I think what DNA testing has done, it's really called into question for people, who is my parent and what is parentage all about? And there are a number of different aspects to it. There can be the concept of biological parentage, and then there's the concept of legal parentage, and then there are issues relating to birth certificates and also family relationships that all flow from this. So a biological parent isn't necessarily a legal parent in law. For example, if you are an egg or sperm donor, then you don't have legal parentage rights and responsibilities for a child. You might be a birth parent, but the child might have been subsequently adopted. So you are no longer a legal parent, or perhaps you've been a surrogate for somebody and the intended parents have got legal parenthood. So there's that biological connection, but and parentage, but not the legal parentage aspect to this. Separately from that, you can be a social parent, and a social parent is somebody that does the job of parenting for a child on a day-to-day basis. So that could be a parent's partner, a new partner. It could be a family relative who stepped into the breach to look after a child, but they're not a biological parent or a legal parent. And then a third category of parentage is legal parentage. And under English law, you can only have two legal parents. And legal parentage is really important in the UK because it gives a legal parent-child connection, which, as I've said, various important rights and responsibilities flow from that. For example, it can give you a legal relationship with other members of your family, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. It gives an inheritance right from a child against a legal parent's estate. It makes a legal parent financially responsible for a child for maintenance in income and capital terms. Being a legal parent dictates who can and shouldn't go on a child's birth certificate. And it also confers a right of citizenship, a nationality, and a claim to a passport where there is a legal parent-child connection. So it's really important in these different sort of aspects and layers of parentage can all be caught up in so many different ways within family life, and really brought under the spotlight when you're doing DNA testing, and lead people down journeys to have to make applications to the court to perhaps rectify a birth certificate, take off a name, add a name, replace a name, and to get important declarations as to who is a biological parent and who is a legal parent, so that they get their genetic ancestry and their legal parentage sorted out for themselves and also for future generations.
So who might need a declaration of parentage? All of the people you mentioned before?
Well, yes, I mean, there's a sort of sort of growing category or group of people that might need one. So there's, first of all, as we talked about, the people who've done a direct-to-consumer DNA test or become aware that, they've either traced somebody they didn't know was their parent, or they need to get that declaration to rectify a birth certificate. It might also be a fertility patient. Sometimes if important HFEA parenthood consent forms are not filled in correctly, or they've been lost, or there's been a problem on them, that can call into question the legal parentage of a non-birth parent. And so sometimes these applications need to be made to rectify that and to clarify the parentage, if you like, of the non-birth parent for the child. It could also be someone who's in a situation where there's a dispute about whether someone is or isn't a parent. Perhaps they've got an inkling, they've done a DNA test, they've got some sense of it, or they need to make an application to get their child's parentage sorted out so that they can get the birth certificate resolved. And it might be somebody as well who's got a situation where they're looking to do it for other means. So perhaps they're looking to try and get a declaration of parentage so that they can have a claim to another citizenship. And since we sort of left the EU, sometimes people are wanting to resolve their lineage because it might help them, with a claim then for, say, Irish citizenship or EU citizenship, which give them an EU passport, which can mean that they've got rights of free movement and residence and work within the European Union. So there's all sorts of different reasons, and I think we'll see more of these unfold over time, but that just gives a bit of a flavour for what parenting is and why parentage can be really important.
It's fascinating, and it's equally complex. And, so to have your expertise is just incredible. And for anyone who has any questions and wants to explore support, please do tap our link in bio to read this article, which Louisa has written all about parentage and DNA ancestry and anonymity. So please, yeah, get in touch with her. And I'd love to ask you, what are your 5 tips from years of professional expertise in this area of family building? Yeah, what would you say to people who might be at the beginning of their journey? They might be midway through. They might be looking for support, having already built part of their family.
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, there's loads of tips I could give, but I think if I were to distill it perhaps down to my top 5, the first is to think about preserving and maximising your fertility. Think about getting fertility testing done. Think about egg, sperm, and embryo freezing, because fertility is really precious and it can be there one minute and it can be gone the next. It only takes an accident, an injury, the passing of time, and your fertility isn't what it was. That's number 1.
I just wanted to mention then, actually, to that point. So I'm 37, and I had an AMH test done when I had IVF at 30 or 31. And and I think my level was something like 14, whatever measurement that was. I then repeated the test through a partnership where we were, exploring at home AMH testing kits, and it had dropped to 4. I then took another one when I went to see a clinic in Spain recently as part of a campaign giveaway we were doing, and I was interested to see the results. I looked at the result last night, and it's now 0.9. And that's over 6 years. So that's a huge drop in what I would say is quite a short space of time.
You're so right. People don't realise that for women, there is a very aggressive, often biological clock. And, your fertility starts to drop in your, early 30s and noticeably from 35, and then increasingly rapidly in just a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And people can have less fertility even earlier, so it's not something that you can just assume is there. So the more people can be aware and just think about this, and really take steps to look after their fertility is so important. You're so right.
And as you mentioned, accidents, because something could happen that might mean that from one day to the next it changes dramatically.
Absolutely. It could be an illness, it could be a misdiagnosis for cancer, and suddenly you're finding yourself where you're having to face urgent cancer treatment, which can, result in lost fertility through chemo, or perhaps aggressive surgery, which, to remove ovaries, or hysterectomy or something. So that, is also a big issue that people just need to be aware of. It's fragile, it's precious. Look after.
Good word, yeah. And what's your second tip?
Second point, I think, would be to think about the genetic aspects of your family build. So think about whether or not you want to do any genetic screening. Are there any genetic predispositions in your family? Is there a history of breast cancer or bowel disease or something which perhaps you might want to get to the bottom of in case you pass that on. You might want to think about genomic medicine as that comes more and more on stream. There's more that can be done to deal with genetic conditions and hereditary conditions, and things that can create problems and ill health. And also the genetic aspects, if you're using egg or sperm donation, think about these issues about anonymity, identity release, DNA testing, and how you're going to manage the reality about using these types of family building arrangements, because they are important, and they're not just part of the decision making.
Mm-hmm.
They follow the family, they follow the child, they follow through in life, and they're there as a significant legacy. So they have to be thought about and managed carefully. My third point would be to make sure that you have a viable family building action plan. Don't leave it to chance and try and muddle through. Make sure that what you want to do is legally possible, it's medically possible, and that you understand what the implications and outcomes will be if you're going to use fertility treatment, or you're going to use donor conception, or surrogacy, or a co-parenting arrangement, whatever it might be, because law can be complicated in real life, and it's not always necessarily what you expect. Point number 4, budget financially for having a family. Think about the cost of having a family, the cost of fertility treatment, and the cost of raising a child. You know, life is expensive. Fertility treatment, you know, it is significant in itself in cost. So have a think about that. And point number 5, do manage the legal aspects carefully with fertility treatment and family life. You know, things like egg and sperm storage and use. Think about you know, birth certificates. Think about legal parentage. Think about parental rights. Who's got decision making for a child? Think about issues to do with the care and upbringing of your child. Think about some of these wider issues. You put on the hop with DNA testing and family dynamics and everything that can come out of that.
Wonderful, wonderful advice. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing all of that. And I really encourage anyone who is looking for any sort of legal support to tap our link in bio or follow Louisa to get in touch for some personalised support and advice. So thank you so much for joining us today, and for everyone who's been with us as well, and for the great questions. Someone just asked about general fertility levels. You can have those checked in a clinic. There are also some at-home testing kits. Depends what you want to check. If you want to send us a DM, we're happy to point you in the right direction. But thank you very much, Louisa.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Lovely to see you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.